13 days in October of 1962, the United States and the Soviet Union stood on the brink of nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis was, in many ways, the apex of the Cold War. That's right, so you would expect it would have been commemorated on American, Soviet, or Cuban coinage. No, in fact, the first coin to commemorate the Cuban Missile Crisis was issued by Liberia on the western coast of Africa in 2001. The Cold War defined so much of world politics for the latter half of the 20th century. That's right, from grade school to television and theater, from Duck and Cover to Dr. Strangelove, Americans were never far from reminders about the dangers that the world faced. Soviet citizens also had their own version of Duck and Cover. Today we're going to be taking a look at the impact of the Cold War on coinage, how these events influenced the design and mintage of coins and currency on both sides of the conflict. The most obvious example is the Kennedy half. From the Bay of Pigs to his Berlin speech, much of what defined the Kennedy administration was directly related to the Cold War. Even after Kennedy's assassination, the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald had for a time defected to the Soviet Union was the cause of a lot of conjecture. What's the most obvious example you can see from Soviet coinage? I got nothing. What do you mean? It didn't really change. What was all that bit you said before, and now you can't come up with one example? The font changed over the years. Other than that, it was pretty much just Soviet crest on the obverse and wheat reverse all through the Soviet years. That's a good point, really. U.S. coinage didn't change all that much during the Cold War either. The reverse of the Lincoln cent changed in '59, and we removed silver in the '60s, but neither one of those is really Cold War related. There was the Eisenhower and Susan B. Anthony dollars, but those aren't really Cold War related. Silver disappeared from Soviet coinage in 1931. There was no need for intrinsic value when the state controlled all the pricing. Maybe what we should do is look at the Great Patriotic War, which you call World War II. That's a good idea. Ideas going that way. When considering the effect of World War II on coinage, the first thing that comes to most people's minds are the Steel War cents of 1943. Because copper was the strategic war material, cents that year were produced out of steel with a zinc coating. There were a lot of problems with this, so the galvanization process didn't cover the coin's edge, so they tended to rust quickly. People would confuse them for dimes, and coin mechanisms would confuse them for slugs. So in 1944, the mint switched to an alloy that utilized spent shell casings and more closely resembled the pre-war composition. I think a better example is the silver war nickels of 1942 to 1945. These coins were made of an alloy of manganese, copper, and silver. They were 35% silver, so 18 of these coins would equate to an ounce of silver, whereas 14 dimes equated to an ounce of silver. That's $1.40 worth of dimes, or just 90 cents worth of nickels. That's the highest silver content relative to its face value of any coin the United States ever produced. So while Europe was racing to replace a lot of its coins with zinc, which is really a horrible coining material, the United States was bucking that trend. If we look at the coins of Japan during World War II, we can see that they started the war with a large 1-cent bronze coin. And as the tide of war turned against the Empire of Japan, they replaced that with a smaller aluminum coin. As the war progressed, they replaced that with an even smaller aluminum coin, and then an even smaller tin and zinc coin. In the final days of World War II, there was a clay 1-cent coin that circulated unofficially through Japan. I think it's fair to say that if you knew nothing of the history of World War II, if you had only the coinage of that period to look at, you could make a fairly accurate assessment about the outcome of the war based just on your observations of that coinage. In 1967, the Soviet Union produced that series of coins to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. Do you think that's an example of the Cold War's effect? No, not really, no more so than the American bicentennial coinage of 1976. If there had been no Cold War, wouldn't they have commemorated the 200th anniversary of their founding anyway? It's kind of like Russia putting Vladimir Lenin on their paper money while the United States put George Washington on theirs. To the Russians, it's just honoring their founding fathers, so it would have been done even if the Cold War had not occurred. Oh, I'm suddenly remembering, Soviet coinage was designed for the proletariat, and Soviets rejected the bourgeois commemorative coins as a relic of the czars, so they issued very little in the way of non-circulating commemoratives until the Moscow Olympic Games of 1980. One of the goals of the Marxists was to do away with money entirely, so there was no need for the decadent designs used by the West, such as their colorful Mickey Mouse dollars. You mean Disney dollars? I know, work with me here. Are we good? Yeah, we should also mention though that notes issued by the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics were issued in glorious color throughout the Cold War years, while American capitalist dollars were issued in monochrome. That sounds decadent. It is not decadent. The United States did issue colorful notes if you consider military payment certificates. That's certainly an area in which we can find an example of the effect of the Cold War on currency. No coin or note is as tied to the Cold War as military payment certificates. These notes, issued by many countries throughout the Cold War era, were special script issued to members of the military. The designs would change periodically, and then only authorized personnel could exchange them for the new notes, and even then only for a limited period of time. This discouraged the black market, as black marketeers would be hesitant to accept military payment certificates for fear that they might be left holding onto them at the end of the exchange period. Another reason the military would use military payment certificates is that low denomination paper money prevented soldiers from accumulating a pocket full of small change, something you wouldn't want in a combat situation. The United States issued military payment certificates in denominations of 5, 10, 25, and 50 cents, as well as $1, $5, $10, and $20 notes. After the Vietnam War, the United States discontinued the use of military payment certificates. Today, ATM cards render them fairly obsolete, so we're unlikely to see them return in the future. However, many of these notes depict Cold War scenes such as planes, tanks, and aircraft carriers, so that makes them an excellent collectible from that Cold War era. From time to time, the Cold War would heat up, resulting in proxy wars in places like Korea and Vietnam. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 led to a protracted war that in many ways hastened the collapse of the Soviet Union. There wasn't much coinage that came out of the Afghan war, only a few commemoratives that clearly are not of Afghani origin nor Russian. Instead, let's take a look at the coinage of the Korean and Vietnam Wars. North Korea issued its first coinage in 1959. From then until the end of the 20th century, most of the circulating coinage displayed on its reverse either no stars, 1 star, or 2 stars. The coinage without any stars on it was intended for use by the local citizens for their day-to-day shopping, while the coinage with 2 stars on it could be exchanged for hard currency by visitors from foreign capitalist countries. It could be used in special stores like Pyongyang's department store number 1, where it could buy luxury goods that were not available to the local citizens, because the hard currency provided by the tourists could be used to restock those stores with luxury goods bought around the world. It was in effect change for foreign exchange certificates. Foreign exchange certificates were issued by many socialist countries in order to separate the shopping of the tourists from the shopping of the locals. But North Korea was fairly unique in that it offered change for those foreign exchange certificates. In between those two extremes is the coins with 1 star on the reverse. These were issued to visitors from foreign socialist countries, and so I guess in effect saying, while you live in a communist hellhole and I live in a communist hellhole, my communist hellhole is somehow more prosperous than yours. The Washington Carver half, produced by the United States from 1951 to 1954, though it doesn't specifically reference anything related to the Cold War, does have an odd bit of verbiage in its enabling legislation that says that funds from the sale of this commemorative half dollar would go to oppose the spread of communism among African Americans in the interest of national defense, though it doesn't specify how that was to be done, and there was no record that any funds were used for any such cause. Once the Soviet Union entered the commemorative coin fray, they produced quite a few commemoratives. Most depict the Great Patriotic War, some ballerina commemoratives, and some famous Russians. In 1981, there was a 1 ruble coin which commemorated Russian-Bulgarian friendship, so that's one that's commemorating a connection between 2 Warsaw Pact countries. Another great example is that the United States added the motto, "In God We Trust," to its paper money in 1957. There was an interest in differentiating themselves from the godless Soviets with their state-mandated atheism. Sorry, it was what it was. The motto also appeared on coins. You might say, well, that it first appeared on the 2-cent piece back in 1864, and that's true, but it wasn't at the time the official motto of the United States. At that time, the unofficial motto was E pluribus unum. It wasn't until 1956 that Congress codified into law that "In God We Trust" would become the national motto. Now let's go to the front line of the Cold War and take a look at the coinage of the divided Germanies. At the Yalta Conference in 1945, Allied leaders agreed to split post-war Germany into 4 zones of occupation to be administered by France, Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. Because each of the wartime allies wanted part of Berlin, it was similarly divided even though it was deep within the Soviet zone of occupation. It was there that the Cold War began and arguably where it ended. After the defeat of Nazi Germany, however, the alliance between World War II allies began to crumble. East Berliners could just walk across the city and get on a flight to West Germany, which resulted in a brain drain. So from June of 1948 until May of 1949, the Soviet Union blockaded Berlin in an attempt to dislodge the other wartime allies. The Berlin blockade was the first real conflict of the Cold War, and it was eventually broken by the Berlin airlift. Yes, so on August 13th of 1961, Berlin residents awoke to discover a new wall bisected their city. With so much happening there, you'd expect to see a lot of impact on the coinage of the post-war Germanys. What was your favorite example? I got nothing. Oh, you sound like that guy. Which guy? Oh, the funny-looking one down there. Anyway, you do have a point, though. Like the American and Soviet coinage, the coinage of East and West Germany didn't really have any significant changes throughout the Cold War era. There were some commemoratives. West Germany minted a lot of 2, 5, and 10 mark commemoratives throughout the Cold War era, but none of them really was Cold War related. East Germany minted a lot of 5, 10, and 20 mark commemoratives, and there are a few that are Cold War related. One celebrated the National People's Army and another celebrated the Workers' Militia. These are 2 forces that were involved in the building of the Berlin Wall. The most directly related coin, of course, is the 20 mark coin of 1990, which celebrates the opening of the Brandenburg Gate on December 22nd of 1989. The Brandenburg Gate is the site of President Kennedy's Berlin speech. It's where President Reagan called on Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down this wall, and it was the last symbolic barrier between East and West Germany. It was not until the end of the Cold War that the United States began issuing silver dollars to commemorate the proxy wars. First there was the Korean War Memorial Dollar of 1991, then the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Dollar of 1994. Also in 1994 there was the Prisoner of War Dollar, and then in 2010 there was the Disabled Veterans Dollar. There were a number of other coins issued to commemorate members of the military, but these 4 specifically commemorate the proxy wars of the Cold War era. Well, those are the examples we were able to muster. Can you think of any that we've overlooked? If so, leave a comment below and maybe we'll add another soldier to the squad. Thanks for watching, and please join us for the next Exact Change video. Well, this is another great mess these guys have left me with. Oh, I don't mean this. I mean that they got together to discuss the effects of the Cold War on coinage, and none of them thought to mention the fact that the United States produced about 1 million dimes in the 1950s and early 1960s that were radioactive. It wasn't a conspiracy, it was actually a tourist display. Visitors to the American Museum of Atomic Energy in Oak Ridge, Tennessee could take a dime from their pocket change and have it inserted in the dime irradiator display. This display would roll the dime past a mixture of radioactive antimony and beryllium, and that would bombard the dime with neutrons, which would convert some of the silver from the isotope silver 109 to silver 110. The dime would then roll past a Geiger counter, which would confirm that it was indeed radioactive, and then it would roll out of the display, and they would take it and put it in a little souvenir holder and give it back to the visitor. The half-life of silver 110 is only 22 seconds, so by the time the visitor left the museum, the dime really wasn't radioactive anymore. The silver 110 would decay into cadmium 110. This process went on from 1949 until a little while after silver was removed from the dime in 1965. By that point in time, about 1 million dimes had been irradiated. Clearly, this is the coin most affected by the Cold War because it was affected at the atomic level.